Hello, I'm David Aldous and welcome to another edition of In Depth. International author and speaker David Pawson joins me once again to talk about his book, When Jesus Returns. Now, just before we start this programme, I would like to say that I know that there are many of you who are watching this programme who are really interested to know about the Great Tribulation. Now, we're not going to deal with the Great Tribulation in this specific programme, but we will be talking about it in future programmes, so do stay tuned. But first of all, David, welcome once again to the programme. Now, I know this is going to be a massive tall order, and when I've said it, I'll just remove my microphone, get up and walk away so that you can just carry on. But could you give us an overview of the book of Revelation?
Actually, it's quite a simple book, David. It divides very neatly into three parts. And the first part deals with the present situation of the church. Originally, it's 7 letters that Jesus wrote to 7 churches in the southwest corner of Turkey, as we know it now, which was a key area. It was a very rich area, a very cultured area. Both Greek and Roman culture had invaded it. There were theaters, stadiums, sports, the Ionic Games. It was a key area, and it was actually, here's the most interesting part, it was where Satan had his headquarters. One of the 7 towns was a town called Pergamum, and just outside the town is this huge high hill, and on top of it they had built libraries and theaters and temples, and one temple in particular, which was in the shape of a huge armchair, 3 rows of columns with an altar in the middle, where a fire was kept burning and a black cloud of smoke went up. And when Jesus wrote to the church in Pergamum, the little town below the hill, he said, I know where you live. That's where Satan lives. That's where his seat is. And once you see that temple of Zeus, the king of the gods, you can see a great armchair. And this was Satan's headquarters. Satan can't be anywhere at once. He can only be in one place. He's a creature like us. And that was his headquarters at that time. And Jesus knew that those little 7 churches, struggling churches, 2nd and 3rd generation churches, if they survived there, his church would survive anywhere. That's the key. And so he wrote to those churches. He never wrote to any other churches, not in Jerusalem or Rome. He wrote to those 7 because this was the test case, the acid test. Would the church survive beyond the 2nd and 3rd generation under the pressure of Greco-Roman culture, under the pressure of money? Because money was invented just there. The coins in your pocket came from a king called Croesus. And you may have heard the proverb, rich as Croesus. That's where it came from. He invented coins. So money, culture, everything was on the pressure of these 7 little churches of humble people. And so he wrote to them. Yet those churches between them represent all the churches through time and space. You can see in a mirror in one of those letters your own church. And so the letters to the 7 churches become the letters of Jesus to all the church, that we may survive. And just before we leave that section, it's interesting that the state of the churches, the problems that they had, or otherwise, were exactly in ratio to their distance from Satan's residence. The 2 churches nearest to Pergamum were being corrupted from the inside by idolatry and immorality. Satan was destroying the nearby churches from the inside. The 2 more distant churches of the 7 were not being destroyed from the inside, but were being attacked by the outside through Jewish synagogues, which Jesus calls the synagogues of Satan. And of course, in the early days, it was the Jews who were the biggest enemies of the Christians. That changed later. And the 2 churches furthest away from Satan's seat in Pergamum were Ephesus and Laodicea. And they were not being persecuted from the outside, nor were they being corrupted from the inside. So what was happening to those 2? One of them, they had lost their first love, and the other had become lukewarm. They were just dying. Now, isn't that interesting? The distance from Satan's throne showed what the problems were in the church. And so Jesus wrote to those 7 churches a personal letter each, describing himself, and then looking at the church. For 2 of those churches, he had no praise for anything good whatever. For 2 of them, he had nothing bad to say, no criticism at all, just encouragement. For the other 3, they were a mixture of good and bad. So he always commended the good before he criticized the bad.
Then looking at those churches as being very relevant to how we are today and how
Absolutely.
the church is today.
I have just been out with a film crew into southwest Turkey, and we've been round the 7 churches, looking at what's left of the towns and cities that were there. But Smyrna is still there. It's a huge port. And the letter to Smyrna is so applicable to the church in Smyrna today, you would not believe it. That church is persecuted. And the letter to Smyrna was nothing but encouragement.
Well, Christianity is totally persecuted in Turkey.
Well, it's a Muslim country.
Yeah.
And that always puts pressure on Christians. But here we've got the first section of the book of Revelation, which frankly people don't have difficulty understanding. They know what letters to churches are like from Paul and James and John, and so they read these letters of Jesus to the churches, and they are very relevant to the church today. And the video I made as a result of that tour has a real prophetic message for the church today. Somewhere in those 7 letters, we all fit. Now then we come to the rest of Revelation. That's when the problems begin. It's like getting out of your depth a bit. And the rest of Revelation divides very neatly into 2 parts. All of it is concerned with the future of the church. Because at the beginning of chapter 4, John, lying in prison, is told, come up to heaven and see God's point of view, and I'm going to show you things that will take place after all this. So from chapter 4 onwards, we're into future. Chapters 1 to 3, present state of the church and what Jesus thinks about it. And incidentally, David, it's not what we think about a church, it's what he thinks about a church that matters. And the 2 he criticizes most are the 2 most successful. Isn't that interesting? How Jesus looks at the church is very different from how we look at it. So, from chapter 4 onwards, future. But there are 2 sections, and I give them 2 very simple titles. Title of the first section, right through to chapter 19, is Things Will Get Much Worse Before They Get Better. And the last section, Things Will Get Much Better After They Get Worse. And it's as simple as that. Chapters 1 to 3 are about the present and what needs to be put right now before the troubles come. And really what Jesus is doing is getting those 7 churches ready for the trouble to come. That's why he's writing to them. Get your own house in order before the pressure comes on you, or you won't stand. But then he tells them quite clearly, and the honesty of Jesus, I love Jesus for his honesty. He didn't tell people, come to me and all your troubles are over. He said, you're going to have big trouble in the world. And Jesus in the middle section is telling John, things are going to get much worse before they get better. And the sheer honesty of that, it's lovely, isn't it? That Jesus would tell us what's going to happen. And then after that, the good news. So it's bad news before it's good news. Things will get worse before they get better. They will get better after they get worse. Now, things will get worse is the section that talks about the big trouble. And it's one trouble after another. However, before Jesus begins to tell John about that, he takes him up into heaven, gives him a vision that in all the troubles, God is at peace. And he sees the throne of God with a rainbow, and in front a glassy sea, a sea without a ripple on it. It's as if he's being shown that God is at peace. God is not going to be disturbed. God is not going to be shaken. The earth is going to be very shaken. But in heaven, everything's under control. And when the worst is happening on earth, God is still in control. there's a little chorus that children are taught, God is still on the throne. But one little girl went home from church singing, God is still on the phone, God is still on the phone. Well, that's a truth. But in fact, Revelation 4 and 5 show you God on his throne in peace. He's not disturbed. There is nothing that happens on earth without his permission. He's still in total control. He can bring about the end that he wants and will. And so John, before he's shown all the troubles of the world, is shown this picture of heaven in control, in peace. And he knows it's going to be all right, that whatever happens down here, up there, God is not being shaken. God is not being dethroned. He's not lost control. I mean, you just read a newspaper, any newspaper, and you could think, gosh, the world's out of control. Stop the world, I want to get off. You know, it's who's controlling things? Nobody. It's chaos. But you need to get the uplook before you get the outlook.
So as Christians, we don't need to be frightened of this. We don't need
No.
to be afraid of it.
Well, I mean, humanly speaking, my flesh doesn't look forward to any of this. But to know that it's going to be all right. The whole emphasis in the Bible is the troubles now are nothing compared with what's going to happen after them. You see? And this, of course, was the life of Jesus. It says that Jesus endured the cross, despising the shame, for the joy that was set before him. He had the long view, and he went through all the trouble, even to death. And it's not nice being crucified. It's a humiliating, painful, horrid death. And yet Jesus went through all that for the joy that was set before him. He was looking forward to what lay beyond it. And if we're going to follow Jesus, he says, you take up your cross first. Before you share my resurrection, you share my cross. Suffering now, joy later. Now, of course, the world wants it the other way around. The world wants happiness now and holiness later. But actually, God's will is holiness now and happiness later. And because you can't have true happiness without holiness. That's the first thing. But everybody wants the happiness now and the holiness sometime later.
Well, that's the way the world is.
Lord, make me holy, but not just yet, you know. But things are going to get bad. Things are going to get worse. I wonder if I could sort of kind of draw a picture for you. There are 5 at least different philosophies of history. Now, I don't like the word philosophy. It simply means the way you think. But there are 5 ways in which people think about history. The ancient Greeks had what's called the cyclic view of history. It just goes round and round. History repeats itself. It doesn't go anywhere. What's happened before will happen again. We're on a roundabout. That's the Greek view.
What goes round comes round.
Yeah, that's all.
Yeah.
History repeats itself is the popular version of it. And history's going nowhere. That's not the Bible view. Then there's what we call the epic view of history, which is that history is moving on. It doesn't repeat itself. Nothing's quite the same, but it goes up and down. And boom and bust, inflation, deflation, war and peace. History just goes on from bad days to good days, and who knows if it'll end on an upper or a downer? Nobody knows. But that's the epic view. That's not the Bible view. Then there's the optimistic view of history, very common at the beginning of our century. I say our century, where are we? The 20th century. Yeah. An English Prime Minister in the beginning of the 20th century had as his political slogan, up and up and up and on and on and on, which sounds great. And the word on everybody's lips at the beginning of the 20th century was progress. It's going to be the happiest, most wonderful, wealthiest, healthiest century of all. Science is going to give us the fruits of good living. And you know, that's why people remember the Titanic. It was the first major disaster of the 20th century and presented the highest achievement of man. It was the biggest moving object man had ever made and the most luxurious. Gone on its maiden voyage. And that's why we remember the Titanic. It was the first major disaster of this optimistic view of history in the 20th century. And then 2 world wars completed the job. And now as we enter the 21st century, nobody's talking about progress. Do you know the word on everybody's lips now? Survival. Survival. And whereas the optimistic view of history was up and up and up and on and on and on, the pessimistic view of history, which is now widespread, is down. In fact, technology is already predicting the end of the world in 2040. Computer programs have had fed into them population growth, food reserves, fuel reserves. When will these run out? When will life on Earth become impossible for whole parts of the human race? And the answer they all come up with is 2040. Now, I don't need to worry about that. You probably do, but 2040? People are pessimistic, and that is why so many, David, are trying to get as much out of the present as they can. Who knows what the future holds? One poll among...
Eat, drink and be merry, for tomorrow we die.
One poll among sixth formers, very few of them believed they would die of old age. Believed the end of the world. So that's the pessimistic view of history. That's not the Bible view either.
And the youth view, Generation X, if you like, although I've now been told that Generation X is a term that is no longer in, but Generation X, most of them don't want to live to their old age.
No.
They're not interested.
Let's live for today. Now then, let's come to the biblical philosophy of history, because I think people need to grasp this. It's very important. It's not that, and it's not that, and it's not that, and it's not that. So what is it?
That.
Here is the view of history in the Bible. And that's called the apocalyptic view. Things will get worse, suddenly better, and stay better. And that is shared by three groups of people on earth: communists, Jews, and Christians. And they all got it from the same place, from the Old Testament Jewish prophets. And the apocalyptic view is things are going to get worse, suddenly better, and stay good. It's that every time. Now the Jews gave that to the world, and Karl Marx was Jewish, and so the communists believe the struggle between the proletariat and the bourgeoisie will get worse and worse and worse, and suddenly the revolution will establish the classless, crimeless society. That's been proved to be a myth. It doesn't work. Russia's proved that. You don't get into the utopian society that way. The Jews believe it. You see, the difference between the three groups is what's going to cause the change? What's going to stop the downward, lift it up, and produce utopia? Marx said the revolution. He was wrong. The Jews say the kingdom of God, that God will break into history and establish his kingdom on earth. They call it the age to come. And so for the Jew, things will get worse until the kingdom of God breaks in and establishes utopia. That's half true. For the Christian, what causes the reversal of history is the return of Jesus Christ to planet Earth. And that's the view of the book of Revelation. And chapters 6 to 19 are that. Chapter 19 says that. And chapters 20, 21, and 22 say that. And there you've got the outline of history. Things will get much worse before they get better, and they will get much better after they get worse. And you've got the message of Revelation. I can't put it more simply than that.
No.
Now, in detail, we're given a lot of details of how much worse it's going to get. And then we're given quite a lot of detail of how much better it's going to get. But we've got to go through the bad news before we get the good news. Now, funnily enough, most people can handle the first part of Revelation, which deals with the churches. What must be put right now? That's fairly straightforward. It's the middle bit they can't handle. Funnily enough, when they get to the good news, they like it.
Yeah.
I mean, it's read at funerals.
Yeah.
I saw a new heaven and a new earth and New Jerusalem, and it's wonderful at the end. So actually most people can handle the beginning of Revelation, and the end of it is the bit in the middle.
This piece that we're talking about between chapters 3 and chapters 19, where it gets worse, does James not talk about that in a sense? James 1:2, where he says, "Consider it pure joy, my brothers, when you face trials of many kinds, because you know that the testing of your faith develops perseverance. Perseverance must finish its work so that you may be mature and complete, not lacking anything." Could that have something to do with this? In other words, in the preparation for the tribulation?
we're in troubles now, not the big trouble yet, but we're in troubles now. And it's troubles that actually mature Christians. Christians who don't have troubles don't mature. Jesus learned obedience by the things he suffered. And we're no different. And it's in fact how we handle bad times that really is the test of our character. The whole book of Revelation has a key word running right the way through it. It's the word overcome. Every one of the 7 letters finishes, he who overcomes, I will reward him in this way. And in fact, at the end, it says, it's only those who overcome who inherit the new heaven and the new earth. It's not just believers. It's overcoming believers.
One of my most favourite verses in the Bible is in Revelation 12:11.
Yes.
He overcame by the blood of the Lamb and by the word of his testimony.
But it's for overcomers, people who come out on top, in a simple language. And the 2 things an overcomer has come out on top of are persecution from outside and temptation from inside. And those who overcome those 2 major pressures on Christians, they're the ones who inherit everything at the end of the book of Revelation. It's not everyone who believes, it's every believer who overcomes. And there are some pretty strong warnings to those who don't overcome, and one of which, the most serious, Jesus says, he who overcomes, I will not blot out his name from the book of life. Now, on the day of judgment, it's vital that my name and yours is in that book.
Amen.
Because if it's not, we've had it. And the thought that my name could be crossed out of the book of life because I haven't overcome by the blood of the Lamb.
How do we make sure that we overcome?
Do you know, I once said to a dear saintly man of God, I said, I don't think I would ever be willing to be thrown to the lions. You know, if it meant martyrdom, I wonder if I could cope. And he said a very wise thing to me. He said, David, if you overcome in little things now, you'll be given the grace to overcome then. And the real test as to how I would behave in a big crisis is how I behave in a little crisis now. In other words, whether I develop a habit of overcoming or giving in, whether I'm over the circumstances now, which are not as bad as they're going to be, or whether I'm under them. And the whole book of Revelation is to help people to overcome, to encourage them by thinking of what lies beyond. We go under because we're only thinking about the present. We're overwhelmed with what's happening now to us and in the world. But if we get beyond that and take the longer view of what's going to happen ultimately, Paul said in Romans, he said, I reckon that this momentary light affliction works an exceeding weight of glory. And what he meant was he'd been shipwrecked, flogged, imprisoned, stoned, he'd been everything. And he said, this is a momentary light affliction. Now, you don't think that way when you're in it.
No, absolutely.
But when you compare it with what lies ahead, it's worth it. It's like a woman having a child. She goes through a lot of pain and struggle, but she's willing to go through with it. I know she has to, in a sense. She can't stop it, but she's looking forward to being a mother with a new baby. And so the pain, yeah, she goes through it, and she struggles, and she sweats, but she knows what it's leading to. You see, and that keeps her going. And when she finally holds the baby, worth it all. Now that's how we should be thinking of the big trouble, you see, of any trouble we have. It's what it's leading to. Jesus said, when you're persecuted for my sake, you just think big reward in heaven. It's all working for your good.
This is actually happening in some parts of the world right now, isn't it? If I think of China, for instance.
Yeah.
To a lesser extent, Russia. I mean, we have associations with Russian churches, and although things are easier, they're still finding it mighty tough.
Oh, they are. But there are villages in China. I've been smuggling Bibles into China, and there are villages there where there are 85% of the population born again. There isn't a village in England anywhere near that. Village churches are closing down here.
I remember,
but that's what pressure is producing.
I remember there was a leader from one of the Chinese churches came to Stoneleigh Bible Week and was preaching, and he said an amazing thing that I've never forgotten, and that is, We are praying for you.
Yeah. I found the same thing when I used to go behind the Iron Curtain.
Pardon? You're praying for
Yeah.
us? Why?
I know.
No, we're praying for you. No. We're praying for you
Absolutely.
because we're seeing this persecution and we're living through this.
Yeah.
And we're seeing growth in the church.
Absolutely. Right. Well, you see the background of the book of Revelation. I think we touched on this earlier. The background was the beginning of really bad persecution on the church at the end of the first century, when this whole thing on the Lordly Day, that's what Domitian called it, on the Lord's Day, you had to sacrifice, you had to pray to the emperor and say Caesar is Lord. And already in one of the 7 letters, Jesus says, I know that you've already got a martyr for me in your church. It was going to be the beginning of 2.5 centuries of Christian persecution, in which thousands would die. And the book of Revelation is really only understood when you're being persecuted. And maybe that's why we make such a meal of it. We're not being persecuted. In China, they love the book of Revelation. They just understand it. They know it's speaking to them under the pressure. And it's encouraging them to stay faithful to Jesus, to be an overcomer, and inherit all that Jesus promised to overcomers. He's not promised these things to believers. He's promised them to overcomers. And that's a message that we need to hear.
There I must stop you. We've run right out of time once again. David, thank you very, very much for joining us. And we'll see you again next week for more of the same. And thanks to you at home for watching. We'll see you again next time at the same time. But until then, may the Lord bless you and may the Lord keep you. Bye-bye for now.